Hey guys, tonight we are taking a little trip back in time. Not to a glorious battle or a royal coronation, but to a moment when the most powerful city on earth was brought to its knees by a truly epic smell. We're diving headfirst, well, maybe not headfirst. That's a terrible idea for this particular story, into the Great Stink of London in 1858. This is a tale of progress, panic, and a whole lot of poop. A time when, according to the top scientists of the day, just breathing the air could literally kill you. So maybe hold your breath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel grow. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where you're all listening from tonight. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing in a rather handsome townhouse in Victorian London. It's the 1852s. The air inside is thick with the smell of coal smoke and beeswax. But there's a sense of immense pride in the air, too. A feeling of progress. You've been led by the homeowner into a small, private room, or water closet, to see the newest and most treasured addition to their home. And there it sits, a gleaming porcelain bowl, often decorated with intricate, hand-painted patterns of bluebells or roses, encased in a polished mahogany cabinet. This is the flush toilet, and in this moment, it feels like the absolute peak of civilization. Before this miracle of modern plumbing, just say, life was, monsieur. The alternative was the chamber pot, a simple ceramic pot you kept under your bed. Once used, it had to be emptied. This often involved a servant making a perilous journey down several flights of stairs, through the house, and out to the cesspit in the backyard or basement. In crowded city tenements, it might just be chucked out the window with a warning cry of Gardez-vous, a corruption of the French Garelot, or watch out for the water. It was, let's be honest, a bit of a nightmare. So now you can see the appeal of this new invention. With a simple pull of a chain, your problems are whisked away by a cleansing torrent of water. It's clean, it's private, it's odorless. It became the ultimate status symbol, the VIP lounge of household appliances. Having one meant you were modern, you were wealthy, and you were, above all, clean. But here's the secret no one was talking about. This elegant solution had a very, very messy problem. Where did it all go? The answer is the first step on our journey to the Great Stink. Each of these beautiful, civilized toilets was being connected to a system that was never, ever designed to handle it. For centuries, London had relied on two things: household cesspits and a network of street drains. The cesspits were essentially brick-lined pits dug beneath houses or in their yards. They were designed to hold solid waste, where it would sit and decompose over time, and would only be emptied by men called night soilmen every few years. The street drains, on the other hand, were only ever meant for rainwater. The flush toilet completely broke this system. Suddenly, gallons and gallons of water were flooding into these self-contained cesspits every single day. They filled up in weeks, not years. The brickwork, not designed to be constantly waterlogged, began to crack and leak. The foul contents would seep into the ground, contaminating the wells from which people drew their drinking water. So the city's engineers and plumbers came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea to solve the overflowing cesspit problem. They started connecting the household toilet pipes directly to the street drains. Problem solved. Right, the waste was no longer under your house, out of sight, out of mind. But you know where those rainwater drains lead. They all slope downhill, and in London, that meant they all lead to one place, the River Thames. Historians are still debating the exact tipping point when the flush toilet went from a quirky luxury for the super-rich to an expected feature in any respectable middle-class home. But by the mid-19th century, the trend was unstoppable. Hundreds, then thousands, Then tens of thousands of these new flushing toilets were being installed across the city, and with every single pull of that elegant chain, a small, private convenience was contributing to a massive, public catastrophe. Each flush was a tiny tributary, joining countless others to form new, unseen rivers flowing just beneath the cobblestones. And these rivers were all carrying their filthy burden to the very heart of the city, turning London's grandest natural feature into the world's largest open sewer. The stage was being set, one flush at a time. So that's where we left it. A million tiny streams of waste, flushed away from the fine homes of London, all converging into the city's ancient, liquid heart. But to truly understand the horror of what was about to happen, you need to forget the image of a sewer. You need to see what the River Thames used to be. Let's rewind, not 50 years, but maybe 100 or two before our story. Stand with me on the riverbank now. The air is different. It's damp, a bit fishy, a bit muddy, but it's the smell of life, not decay. The water before you isn't a murky brown sludge, it's a living, breathing entity. Look closely. You can see the flicker of silver scales beneath the surface. For centuries, the Thames was famous for its salmon, date, healthy fish that would run up the river to spawn. Kings and commoners alike prized them. An apprentice's contract in London often included a now unthinkable clause that he would not be forced to eat salmon more than 3 times a week. Imagine that. Being tired of fresh salmon. The river is also a highway. It's London's busiest street. Forget traffic jams on London Bridge, the real action is here. You see hundreds of small boats, the W. Harrys, crisscrossing the water. They're the taxis of their day, rowed by famously foul-mouthed and witty watermen. If you want to get from Westminster to the Tower of London, you don't battle through muddy, crowded streets. You hail a boat. The river is the city's artery, carrying people, goods, and news. In the winter, on the rare occasions it freezes solid, the city doesn't stop. It celebrates. They hold frost fairs on the ice, with stalls selling gingerbread, puppet shows, and even printing presses set up to print souvenirs. The river isn't a barrier or a threat, it's the center of the community. And look down at the muddy shoreline exposed by the low tide. You see small figures, mostly children and the elderly, stooped over, scouring the mud. These are the mudlarks. They are the poorest of the poor. And the river is their only lifeline. They sift through the muck and river gravel, searching for anything they can sell: lumps of coal that have fallen from barges, old bits of rope, copper nails. Maybe, if they're incredibly lucky, a dropped coin. It's a hard, grim existence. But it's a living, and it shows that the river gives, even to those who have nothing. Now, it's important to be realistic here. Historians still debate just how pristine the pre-industrial Thames truly was. It was never a crystal clear mountain spring. London has always been a city, and cities have always produced waste. Tanneries dumped animal hides and chemicals. Slaughterhouses washed blood and offal into its tributaries. And the simple runoff from the streets carried all sorts of grime into the water. But the key difference was one of scale, and of nature's ability to cope. The river was wide and tidal. The sheer volume of water, combined with the twice-daily cleansing wash of the tides, could dilute and disperse the waste. The river's ecosystem, while under stress, was still functioning. It could still breathe. But by the time those first flush toilets began to appear, that balance was already tipping. The Industrial Revolution was pouring a new kind of filth into the river. Factories lined its banks, disgorging chemical waste. The city's population was exploding, far beyond what the old systems could handle. The salmon were the first to go. By the early 1800s, catching a salmon in the Thames was a newsworthy event. Soon, they vanished entirely. Other, hardier fish followed. The water itself began to change. Its color deepened from a healthy, murky green to a sickly, opaque brown. On warm days, the smell began to change, too. That old, Earthy, fishy smell was being replaced by something else. Something sharper, more sinister. So when London decided to connect its brand new, water-guzzling toilets to its ancient drains, it was polluting a pure, untouched river. It was delivering the final, fatal blow to a system that was already dying. It was force-feeding a patient who was already choking. The river that had been a highway, a pantry, and a playground was being officially repurposed. It was now a conveyor belt, designed for one purpose, only to carry London's secrets away. But soon, it would stop carrying them away, and instead, it would throw them right back in the city's face. So you have this river, once a source of life, now a bubbling, bound, and increasingly fragrant soup of industrial and human waste. And you might be thinking, okay, that's disgusting, but is it really a city-wide emergency for us today? The answer is obvious. We know about bacteria, about E. coli, about waterborne pathogens. But for the average Victorian, the threat wasn't something invisible and microscopic. It was the smell itself. The smell was the monster. This is where you have to wrap your head around a concept that feels completely alien to us now, but was considered cutting-edge science back then: the miasma theory. Close your eyes and try to picture it. You're walking through a London street. The air is already a cocktail of coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed bodies. But from the direction of the river, and wafting up from the grates in the street, is a new, aggressive odor. It's a heavy, sweet, gag-inducing smell of decay. To you, a well-educated Victorian, this isn't just unpleasant. It's a physical threat. You believe that this foul air, this miasma, is the direct cause of disease. The theory went like this: when organic matter, like animal carcasses, rotting vegetables, polluted the contents of the entire city's toilets, decayed, it released a poisonous vapor, a miasma. If you inhaled this vapor, it would get into your bloodstream and cause you to fall ill with diseases like cholera, typhoid, or the plague. It made a strange kind of sense. The poorest, smelly street parts of the city were also the sickest. Epidemics always seemed to flourish in places that reeked of filth and squalor. Therefore, the smell must be the thing that was making people sick. The logic was simple, direct, and completely wrong. This belief was so powerful that it dictated public health policy for decades. The sanitary reformers, the public health heroes of their day, were obsessed with ventilation and deodorizing. Their big idea was to wage a war on bad smells. They believed that if you could get rid of the stench, you would get rid of the disease. So they would do things that seem utterly bizarre to us. They would advocate for wider streets, not to ease traffic, but to allow fresh air to blow away the miasmas. They would plant trees, not just for beauty, but because they believed the leaves would help purify the foul air. During cholera outbreaks, this fear would reach fever pitch. People would walk around with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or perfume pressed to their faces. They would burn barrels of tar or sprinkle chloride of lime in the streets, hoping the strong chemical smell would overpower and neutralize the deadly miasma. One of the most common pieces of medical advice was to keep your windows shut tight, especially at night, to prevent the night air, which was considered especially thick with miasma, from seeping into your home and sickening your family. It's a sad irony that in trying to protect themselves from an imaginary airborne threat, they were often trapping themselves inside with the real, invisible dangers. This brings us to a rather quirky little detail of Victorian life that was born directly from this fear. Wealthy people became obsessed with fragrance, not just a little spritz of perfume behind the ears, but a full-on aromatic assault. Their homes were filled with potpourri bowls. They carried around pomme d'oreilles, which were small, ornate metal bowls filled with solid perfume or aromatic herbs, that they could lift to their nose whenever a particularly nasty whiff came their way. A little-known fact is that the iconic Victorian Tussie Masai small, handheld bouquet of flowers wasn't just a pretty accessory. It was a personal, portable anti-miasma device. If a lady was walking through a smelly part of town or felt faint, she could bury her nose in her bouquet of fragrant flowers and herbs to ward off the dangerous vapors. It was a beautiful, elegant gas mask. Historians still debate how universally the miasma theory was accepted. While it was the dominant scientific theory, there were always dissenting voices and folk beliefs. Some people clung to older ideas about disease being a punishment from God, while others had a more practical, though not quite correct, sense that it had something to do with being poor and malnourished. But in halls of power, in the newspapers, and among the doctors and engineers who would have to confront the coming crisis, miasma was king. So as the summer of 1858 approached, Londoners were living in a state of constant, low-grade aromatic terror. They were unknowingly drinking water contaminated with deadly bacteria, but they weren't terrified of the smell coming off it. Every foul gust of wind from the Thames didn't just wrinkle their noses, it sent a jolt of genuine fear through them. They were convinced that the river wasn't just becoming an open sewer. It was becoming a gigantic, bubbling cauldron of poison gas, ready to rise up and suffocate them all. And they were about to find out just how bad it could get. The elegant flush toilet was the flashy, modern culprit, and the miasma theory provided the terror. But the real accomplice in this story, the silent, structural failure that made the whole disaster possible, was hiding right under your feet. Let's take a moment to venture into the dark, cramped, and frankly disgusting world of London's subterranean landscape before the Great Stink. Imagine you're walking down a bustling London street in, say, you're building above ground. It's a chaotic symphony of horse-drawn carriages, shouting vendors, and clattering footsteps. But just a few feet below the chaos lies a secret, ancient, and crumbling world, a legacy of centuries of makeshift solutions. This isn't a unified system, it's a tangled mess of pipes, drains, and pits. A bit like finding Roman ruins, medieval plumbing, and last year's botched DIY project all jumbled together. The oldest and most fundamental part of this system is the cesspit. You've got one under your house, or in the small yard out back. It's essentially a brick-lined tank, maybe 10 feet deep. For hundreds of years, this was the only solution for human waste. Everything from your household, not just the chamber pots, but kitchen scraps and other refuse went in there. The idea was that the liquid would seep away into the surrounding soil, and the solids would slowly decompose. Every few years, when it got too full, you'd hire the night soilmen. These were the unsung, and undoubtedly smelly, heroes of the pre-modern city. They would come, as their name suggests, only at night, to shovel out the sludge, load it onto carts, and haul it out of the city to sell to farmers as fertilizer. It was a closed-loop, sustainable system, in its own grimy way. But by the 19th century, this system was in absolute crisis. The population of London had exploded. A city built for 1 million people was now straining to hold 2.5 million. Houses were built closer together, and the cesspits were overflowing. The ground beneath the city became saturated with filth. It leached into the foundations of buildings, making them perpetually damp. And, most dangerously, it seeped into the wells that thousands of Londoners still relied on for their drinking water. They were, quite literally, drinking their own, and their neighbors' sewage. Then you have the sewers. But you have to erase the modern image of a sewer from your mind. These weren't the grand, walled tunnels we think of today. Most of London's sewers were originally just old streams and rivers that had been bricked over as the city expanded. The Fleet River, for example, once a clear stream flowing into the Thames, was now the Fleet Sewer, a subterranean torrent of grime. These were never designed to carry human waste. They were storm drains, meant to carry rainwater off the streets and into the Thames. Here's a weirdly fascinating, and slightly horrifying, tidbit about this subterranean world. It had its own ecosystem, and its own explorers. There was a strange subculture of men known as Tashir-S, or sewer hunters. They were a step up from the mudlarks, armed with a long staff, a lantern, and a canvas sack. They would brave the crumbling brickwork and the rats to wade through the sewers, sifting the filth for lost valuables, coins, spoons, bits of metal, even jewelry that had been accidentally washed down a drain. It was incredibly dangerous work. A sudden rainstorm could cause a lethal surge of water, and the risk of disease was immense. But for these men, the city's waste was their treasure. They were the bottom feeders of London's economy, living off the scraps of the world above. Connecting the new flush toilets directly to these old rainwater sewers was the decision that sealed London's fate. It seemed like a quick fix. The cesspits were full, so just bypass them, send the waste straight into the sewers and let the river handle it. What could go wrong? Well, everything. These old, often flat-bottomed brick sewers were never meant to carry thick, semi-solid waste. It didn't flow properly. It would settle on the bottom, creating vast, stagnant banks of sludge. The tunnels, designed for rushing rainwater, became elongated cesspits, fermenting and generating enormous quantities of flammable and foul-smelling methane gas just beneath the city streets. Sometimes, this gas would build up and explode, blasting manhole covers into the air like cast iron frisbees. So you have this perfect storm brewing underground. You have overflowing cesspits poisoning the ground in the wells. You have a network of ancient sewers being choked with waste they were never meant to carry. And you have an army of brand new flush toilets, each one pumping gallons and gallons of water into this collapsing system, accelerating the whole process. Historians still argue about which single factor was the most destructive: the sheer volume of the population, the failure to upgrade infrastructure, or the blind faith in the flush toilet as a miracle cure. But the truth is, they were all cogs in the same machine of disaster. The entire subterranean level of London had become a pressurized tank of filth, and the River Thames was its only safety valve. The city was literally sitting on a time bomb of its own making. All it needed was the right trigger to make it go off, and that trigger would be the weather. So the stage is set. London's underground is a disaster waiting to happen. The river is a receptacle of all things foul, and everyone is terrified of a phantom menace called miasma. The system is at its breaking point. All it needs is a little push. That push came in the form of the weather, specifically, the long, put, and relentlessly dry summer of 1858. Let's transport you to that June. Usually, London summers are a bit of a mixed bag. You get some lovely sunny days, but they're often interrupted by a classic British downpour. A good, solid rainstorm acts as the city's reset button. It flushes out the drains, scours the streets, and raises the water level in the river, helping to wash everything out to sea. London, in its own dysfunctional way, relied on these regular rains to keep the worst of its filth moving. But the summer of 1858 was different. From the beginning of June, the skies over London seemed to forget how to rain. The sun beat down day after day from a hazy, cloudless sky. A heat wave settled over the city, the kind that makes cobblestones hot to the touch and turns the air thick and still. For Londoners, used to a damp, temperate climate, it was oppressive. People felt lethargic, irritable. The rich who could afford it were already starting to plan their escape to the seaside or their country estates. But for the city itself, the heat and the lack of rain were creating a catastrophic chemical reaction. Think about the River Thames. In a normal summer, the massive volume of water, even polluted water, combined with the regular flushing of rain, kept things manageable. But now, without rain, the river's flow became sluggish. The water level dropped lower and lower, revealing vast, shelving banks of black, stinking mud on either side. This wasn't the normal, earthy mud of the mudlarks. This was something new. This was a thick, greasy sediment composed of centuries of filth, but now supercharged with the fresh, concentrated sewage from hundreds of thousands of flush toilets. As the sun beat down on these exposed mudflats, it essentially started to cook them. The gentle process of decay turned into a furious, bubbling fermentation. You could literally see bubbles of methane and hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs, their signature smell, plopping up from the sludge and popping on the surface. The river was, in the most literal sense, stowing in its own juices. This had a secondary effect that made everything worse. The lower water level of the river meant the twice daily tides, which were supposed to be London's great saviour, became its enemy. Normally, a high tide would push a large volume of seawater up the river, diluting the pollution, and then, as the tide went out, it would drag it all back out to sea. But with the freshwater flow from upstream so weak, the sewage wasn't being effectively flushed away. Instead, the tide would pick up the filth from central London, carry it a few miles upstream to places like Chelsea, and then, as the tide turned, it would slosh it all back downstream past the city centre again. The heart of London was being washed, twice a day, in its own concentrated waste. It was like a giant, disgusting washing machine, stuck on a rinse cycle that only ever used dirty water. Let's not forget the quirky, almost unbelievable details. The water of the Thames became so de-exigmenting and so thick with pollutants that it changed chemically. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but widely reported at the time, that when scientists from the Royal Institution tried to test the water's opacity, they found it was almost totally opaque. A piece of white paper disappeared from view just an inch or two below the surface. Some even claimed the fumes were so potent they would discolor the paint on ships moored in the river and tarnish the brass fittings. Historians still debate the exact temperatures and lack of rainfall that summer, as meteorological records weren't as precise as they are today. But contemporary accounts are unanimous: it was a period of exceptional and prolonged heat and drought. Charles Dickens, writing in his journal, described the Thames as a deadly sewer. In the place of a fine, fresh river, Michael Faraday, one of the greatest scientists of the age, famously took a boat trip and dropped pieces of white card into the water, watching them vanish immediately, as a protest to highlight the river's appalling state. So you have this perfect, awful recipe. Take one dying river, add the concentrated waste of 2.5 million people, let it simmer under a relentless sun for weeks on end. Remove the one ingredient trade that was keeping the whole thing from boiling over. The result was inevitable. The gentle, background smell of a polluted city was about to transform into something else entirely. It was about to become a physical presence, a monstrous, city-enveloping entity that would go down in history. The great stink was no longer brewing. It was ready to be served. It's one thing to live in a city with a smelly river. It's another thing entirely when the smell decides to get up. Leave the river. I'm moving with you. In mid-June of 1858. That's exactly what happened. This was a gradual worsening. By all accounts, it was a sudden, dramatic escalation. The great stink, the real great stink, had arrived. Imagine waking up one morning. It's another hot, stuffy day. You open your window, hoping for a breath of fresh air, but what hits you is a physical force. It's not just a bad smell. It's a thick, tangible wave of stench that seems to coat the back of your throat. A contemporary newspaper, the City Press, described it as a nauseating smell that was perceptible at every hour of the day. But even that feels too polite. People at the time struggled for words to describe it. It was a complex bouquet. There was the underlying rotten egg smell of hydrogen sulfide, the sharp, acrid scent of industrial chemicals, and woven through it all, the sweet, cloying, unmistakable odor of human waste on a colossal scale. The stench seeped into everything. It crept under doorways and through keyholes. It clung to curtains and upholstery. It settled on your clothes and in your hair. You couldn't escape it. You'd sit down for dinner, and the smell would be your uninvited guest, ruining the taste of your food. You'd try to sleep, but the foul air would be right there with you, thick and heavy in the darkness. For the people living right on the riverbanks, it was a waking nightmare. They were living inside the smell. But the truly remarkable thing about the great stink was its reach. It wasn't confined to the riverside. It rolled through the streets of the city like an invisible fog. It wafted up through the sewer grates, which were now acting like chimneys for the fermenting filth below. People miles away from the Thames complained of the overpowering odor. It was a city-wide phenomenon, a sheer, inescapable, olfactory assault. This, of course, triggered mass panic, thanks to our old friend, the miasma theory. Remember, people believed this smell was literally the plague waiting to happen. Every lung, if you will, of this foul air was, in their minds, a dose of poison. Newspapers began running sensational headlines, predicting an imminent cholera outbreak that would dwarf all previous epidemics. They called the Thames a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Doctors reported a surge in cases of fainting, vomiting, and diphtheria, all of which they blamed on the noxious air. Whether the stink was actually causing these specific ailments, or if it was simply the psychological effect of constant nausea and fear, is impossible to know. But the terror was very real. This led to some truly desperate and, in hindsight, slightly comical attempts to fight back. The most famous was the use of chloride of lime. The authorities ordered tons of it to be dumped directly into the Thames at the points where the main sewers discharged. The idea was that the strong chemical smell of the lime would neutralize the stink. Workmen were sent out on barges, shoveling the white powder into the brown water. For a few hours, in the immediate vicinity, the dominant smell might shift from pure sewage to sewage with a chemical chaser. But it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Here we find a bizarre, little-known detail of the crisis, the Parliament's own specific battle. The brand new, majestic Houses of Parliament, a symbol of British pride and power, had been rather unwisely built right on the riverbank. Their state-of-the-art ventilation system, designed to draw in fresh air, now did the exact opposite. It efficiently pumped the concentrated stench of the Thames directly into the chambers and committee rooms. The situation became so unbearable that they resorted to soaking the building's heavy curtains in a solution of chloride of lime, hanging them in the windows in a futile attempt to filter the air. You have to picture it: the most powerful men in the world, debating the fate of a global empire, while their eyes watered and their stomachs churned, surrounded by damp, chemically scented drapes. It's a perfect metaphor for the whole crisis, a grand facade hiding a stinking reality. Historians still debate the true smell of the Great Stink. Descriptions are subjective and oft unwildly exaggerated for dramatic effect in newspapers. Was it really a single, monolithic stench, or did it vary from street to street? A complex geography of different types of foulness. Some accounts emphasize a corporeal tang from industrial waste, while others focus on the demigoal smell. It was likely a symphony of all these things. A smell so complex and overwhelming that it defied simple description. The Great Stink was no longer a problem. It was the only problem. It dominated every conversation, from the Queen's Palace to the poorest slum. It brought the city to a standstill, not through flood or fire, but through an invisible, suffocating force. And its most important victim was about to be the government itself, trapped in its riverside palace, forced to either act or suffocate. The time for ignoring the problem was over. The time for desperate measures was at hand. Nowhere was the Great Stink felt more acutely, or more ironically, than in the one place that actually had the power to fix it: the Houses of Parliament. This grand, Gothic revival masterpiece, a soaring monument to British democracy and imperial might, had one fatal design flaw in the summer of 1858. It was located right next to the source of the problem. Imagine you are a member of Parliament, an MP. You are, by definition, one of the most powerful men in the country. You arrive for your day's work in a handsome carriage, dressed in fine wool, ready to debate the intricacies of a new treaty with India or a trade dispute with America. But the moment you step out of your carriage into New Palace Yard, you're hit by the wall of stench. It's unavoidable. The grand debating chambers and quiet libraries you work in have been designed with large, stately windows facing the river, offering what was supposed to be a picturesque view. No, that view is of a brown, bubbling sewer, And those windows are portals for the foulest air imaginable. As we touched on before, the building's own modern ventilation system had become a weapon against its occupants, dutifully sucking in the miasma from the Thames and distributing it evenly throughout the building. The effect on the daily business of government was catastrophic. The stench was so distracting, so physically sickening, that it became impossible to conduct normal proceedings. Members would sit with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The magnificent, leather-bound books in the parliamentary library were said to be absorbing the smell, their pages turning brown from the fumes. The official records from that time, known as Hansard, paint a vivid picture of the chaos. Debate after debate was derailed by complaints about the smell. An MP would stand up to talk about the budget, only to be interrupted by another member gagging and demanding that the windows be closed. But closing the windows in the middle of a heatwave turned the chambers into sweltering ovens. They would rapt suffocate from heat, or be poisoned by the air. One of the most famous anecdotes comes from the committee rooms, which were located on the ground floor, even closer to the river. The stink here was so intense that MPs were seen fleeing, hands over their mouths, abandoning their work. On June 29th, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man named Benjamin Disraeli, who would later become a famous Prime Minister, was reported to have fled a committee room, handkerchief to his face, declaring the smell a horrid thing. He wasn't being dramatic. The business of running an empire was grinding to a halt because the politicians literally couldn't stomach it. This is where we get one of my favorite little-known facts of the whole affair. In a desperate attempt to continue working, the Parliament authorized an extraordinary measure. They paid for huge quantities of chalk lime, chloride of lime, and carbolic acid to be spread along the forehair of the Thames right outside the building during low tide. They hired workmen whose sole job was to perform this task for hours every day. The cost was immense, around £1, 500 a week, which is a fortune in today's money, just on deodorant for the riverbank. This created a truly bizarre spectacle. While MPs inside were trying to debate law, outside their windows, a small army of men in flat-bottomed boats and wading through black mud were engaged in a chemical war with the river, a war they were visibly losing. This proximity of the problem to the seat of power was crucial. For years, the pollution of the Thames had been a problem for other people. It was a problem for the poor in riverside slums like Lambeth and Southwark. It was a problem for the fishermen whose livelihoods had vanished. It was a problem for the people drawing their water from contaminated pumps. But it wasn't a direct, personal, physical assault on the lawmakers themselves. No, it was. The Great Stink had managed to do what years of petitions, scientific reports, and reformers' warnings could not. It made the problem personal for the people in charge. Historians still debate how much of the MPs' panic was genuine fear of disease versus simple disgust and political pressure. Was it the miasma theory that truly spurred them to action, or was it the sheer, unbearable unpleasantness of it all? Combined with the relentless mocking they were receiving in the newspapers, the press was having a field day, portraying the government as powerless, literally being chased from their offices by a bad smell. Whatever the primary motivation, the result was the same. The legislative inertia that had defined the issue for decades was about to be shattered. The river had become a lobbyist, a very effective, if smelly, one. It had marched right up to the front door of Parliament and was now banging on it, demanding to be heard. The men inside had a choice. They could abandon their new palace and flee the city, which would be a humiliating admission of defeat, or they could finally do something about the monster they had helped create. The stink had forced their hand, faced with an invisible, suffocating enemy. The people of London, from the highest official to the humblest shopkeeper, did what people always do in a crisis. They tried a lot of things that didn't work. The city in the summer of 1858 became a giant, desperate laboratory for useless remedies, a frantic battle of perfume against a flood of filth. Let's go back to the streets. The most widespread official response, as we've seen with Parliament, was the war of chemicals. The Metropolitan Board of Works, the city's governing body, was spending a fortune on deodorizers. Every day, barges would chug up and down the Thames, and carts would rattle through the streets, all part of a massive, city-wide effort to cover up the smell. The main weapon was still chloride of lime, a bleaching powder. They dumped it by the shovel fuel into the mouths of sewers and sloshed it onto the riverbanks. The idea was to replace one overpowering smell with another, slightly less offensive one. The problem was, it was a cosmetic solution to a structural catastrophe. It did almost nothing. The sheer volume of new sewage pouring into the river every minute completely overwhelmed the neutralizing effects of the lime. It was, as one newspaper scornfully put it, like a lady throwing a bottle of scent into a pigsty. Worse, some historians suggest that the lime, being a powerful alkali, might have actually made the chemical soup of the Thames even more bizarre and unpredictable. But the official efforts were just the beginning. Individual Londoners, driven by fear and disgust, developed their own coping strategies. You would see people walking down the street with a handkerchief held to their nose. But this wasn't just any old handkerchief. It would be doused in something fragrant and, they hoped, protective for the wealthy. This meant expensive French perfumes like eau de cologne. For the less well-off, it might be vinegar, which was believed to have strong antiseptic properties, or just a handful of crushed herbs like lavender or rosemary. The city must have smelled like a strange, chaotic mix of a sewer, a chemical plant, and a confused herb garden. Inside their homes, people waged a similar, futile war. Windows were kept shut, even in the blistering heat. Gaps under doors were stuffed with rags. They burned anything they thought might purify the air. Incense, popular for centuries in churches, saw a surge in domestic use. They burned tar, believing its that acrid smoke would drive out the miasma. They even burned coffee beans, a practice still used today to clear the palate when testing perfumes, hoping it would at least temporarily reset the air in a room. And of course, there were the Tussie Massais and Pomme de Rest we talked about, the personal air fresheners of the Victorian era, which were now being clutched with a new desperation. This leads us to a strange and slightly sad little niche market that popped up: quack cures and miracle inventions. The advertising columns of newspapers were filled with ads for all sorts of anti-miasmatic devices. There were patent air-purifying respirators, which were often little more than a bit of sponge in a metal cage that you strapped to your face. There were carbolic smoke balls, rubber bulbs you could squeeze to puff a cloud of supposed disinfectant into a room. And there were countless tonics and pills that claimed to strengthen your constitution against the effects of the foul air. Of course, none of these did anything to stop someone from contracting a waterborne disease, but they offered a psychological comfort, a feeling of doing something in the face of an overwhelming threat. One of the most delightfully absurd ideas came from a man named John G. F. Crease. He was the chief decorator for the new Houses of Parliament, and he wrote a letter to the editor of the Times with a grand proposal. His idea was to build enormous canvas awnings, like giant sails, all along the riverbanks. These awnings would be kept constantly soaked in a disinfecting fluid, and he believed the wind blowing through them would be filtered and purified before it reached the city's streets. It was a magnificently impractical and expensive idea that, thankfully, was never attempted. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these remedies. Did people genuinely believe that a lime-soaked curtain would save them from cholera? Or was it a form of ritual? A way of managing overwhelming anxiety? It's likely a mix of both. In the absence of a real solution, people will cling to any solution, no matter how flimsy. These actions gave them a sense of agency. They couldn't stop the river from stinking, but they could control their own little bubble of air, even if only in their imagination. All these efforts, the chemicals, the perfumes, the closed windows, the crazy inventions highlight the fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. They were all aimed at the symptom, the smell. They were trying to treat a headache with a heart. The real problem, the contamination of the water itself, was still being almost completely ignored by the mainstream scientific and political establishment. London was spending a fortune trying to make its poison smell better, rather than trying to stop drinking it. But the ghost of a disease that had haunted them for decades was about to force a reckoning with the truth. As the Great Stink tightened its grip on London, it wasn't just a fear of the unknown that haunted the city. It was the memory of a very specific, very real, and very recent monster cholera. To understand the sheer terror of 1858, you have to understand the trauma of 1831, Yobusaba, and 1854. Cholera was a new and horrifying disease for the 19th century. It had swept out of India, arriving in Britain for the first time in 1831. And it was unlike anything people had seen before. It was terrifyingly swift. A person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Its symptoms were violent and dehumanizing, leading to a rapid, catastrophic loss of fluids. It was a disease that left its victims ashen and shrunken, a terrifying spectacle for their loved ones. And worst of all, no one knew what caused it or how it spread. The first major London outbreak, in 1831, the Tito, killed over 6,500 people. It was a shock to the system. But it was the second great outbreak, in 1848-49, that truly cemented its reputation as the ultimate urban plague. That epidemic claimed over 14,000 lives in London alone. Imagine that, in a city of 2.5 million. That's a staggering number. It was a city-wide trauma. Everyone knew someone who had died. Everyone had seen the death carts rattling through the streets. Then it came back again, in 1853-54, killing another 10,000 Londoners. This recent memory was seared into the public consciousness. So when the year in 1858 turned foul, the immediate, instinctive conclusion for almost everyone was it's happening again. This is where the miasma theory played its most devastating role. The connection seemed so obvious, so logical. Cholera outbreaks always hit the poorest, most crowded, and smelly street parts of the city the hardest. The slums of Lambeth and so forth, with their open sewers and rotting garbage, were always the epicenters. The rich, living in their airy, fragrant squares in the West End, were largely spared. Therefore, the bad air, the miasma rising from the filth, must be the carrier of the disease. The official report written after the 1854 epidemic, a huge and detailed study, concluded that cholera was, without a doubt, an airborne disease. The most respected doctors and scientists in the country had signed off on it. It was official. It was science. So in the summer of 1858, as the smell from the Thames grew into a monstrous entity, it felt like a prophecy being fulfilled. People genuinely believed they were breathing in the very stuff of cholera. This wasn't just a fear of getting sick, it was a fear of a specific, agonizing, and almost certain death. Every nauseating whiff from the river was a reminder of the recent dead, of the funeral bells, of the terror that had gripped the city just 4 years earlier. This deep-seated fear led to some interesting, and ultimately tragic, public health measures. During previous outbreaks, local parishes would light huge bonfires in the streets. This wasn't for warmth or light, it was to burn away the miasma. The hope was that the heat and smoke would cleanse the air of its invisible poison. It was a dramatic, almost medieval response to a modern problem, a ritual of purification against a plague they couldn't see. One of the more peculiar, little-known beliefs was about the cholera cloud. Some people were convinced that the miasma would visibly manifest as a low-lying mist or fog, often seen hovering over the river or in damp, marshy areas at dawn or dusk. Spotting such a fog could cause panic in a neighborhood. People would rush indoors, sealing their homes against the creeping, venomous cloud. Of course, London is a foggy city, but in the context of a cholera scare, this normal meteorological phenomenon was transformed into a harbinger of death. The link between the stench and the disease was so firmly established that the very absence of a major cholera outbreak during the Great Stink of 1858 was, to many, a baffling mystery. The smell was worse than it had ever been, by the logic of miasma. The death toll should have been apocalyptic. Yet, it wasn't happening. There were scattered cases of other diseases, but the full-blown cholera epidemic that everyone was expecting failed to materialize. This was a confusing contradiction that the scientific establishment struggled to explain. Why was the cause present in its most powerful form ever, yet the effect was missing? Historians and epidemiologists are still fascinated by the cholera-free nature of the Great Stink itself. Some argue it was simple luck. The specific Vibrio cholerae bacteria might not have been widespread in the water system at that precise moment. Others suggest that the sheer foulness of the Thames water might have, paradoxically, made it unbelievable to the most desperate, who sought out other, perhaps safer, water sources. But for the people at the time, this lucky break didn't feel like a relief. It felt like a ticking clock. The monster was at the door, roaring louder than ever. It was only a matter of time before it broke the door down. The city held its breath, waiting for the wave of death they were sure was coming. And in the background, one man had been shouting the real answer all along, but almost no one was listening. In the great, noisy, panicked theater of the Great Stink, with everyone staring up at the sky and fearing the air they breathed, there was one man sitting quietly in the audience, pointing at the water glass and insisting, "The poison is in there." His name was John Snow, and in 1858, he was widely regarded as a brilliant anesthetist, and a bit of a crank. John Snow's story is a classic tale of scientific insight clashing with established dogma. He wasn't a public health official or a government advisor. He was a working physician, best known for his pioneering work in anesthesiology. In fact, he was so respected in that field that he had personally administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of 2 of her children. He was an insider, but his ideas about cholera were pure heresy. His journey to the truth began during the earlier cholera outbreak of 1848-49, while everyone else was looking for evidence of miasma. Snow was doing something radically different. He was talking to people. He was mapping the outbreaks, house by house, street by street, and he started to notice a pattern. The disease didn't seem to spread randomly on the wind. It seemed to follow the lines of the water supply. He published a small pamphlet in 1849, titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, where he laid out his theory. He argued that cholera was not an airborne disease, but a gut disease. The poison, as he called it, was ingested, multiplied in the intestines, and then spread through the contamination of drinking water with the waste of infected patients. It was a neat, logical theory, but it was almost completely ignored. The miasma theory was too powerful, too entrenched. The idea of tiny, invisible organisms in the water causing disease was just a step too far for most. His great "I told you so" moment, or what should have been, came during the 1854 outbreak, 4 years before the Great Stink. This is the story he's most famous for. A sudden, vicious outbreak of cholera erupted in the Soho district of London. In just 10 days, over 500 people died in a small area of a few city blocks. It was a perfect, tragic case study. While other doctors were sniffing the air and blaming a local sewer, Snow went to work with his maps. He started knocking on doors, asking the families of the dead a simple question: where did you get your water? The answers all pointed to one place: a public water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. He noticed strange anomalies that supported his case. For instance, the workers at a nearby brewery were almost entirely unaffected. Why, they drank the beer they brewed, and they had their own deep well on site. There was also the case of a workhouse in the area that had very few cases. Snow investigated and found it had its own private well and didn't use the Broad Street pump. Armed with this data, Snow went before the local parish authorities, the Board of Guardians, and presented his evidence. He couldn't prove what was in the water, only that the water was the source of the problem. He famously convinced them to take the handle off the Broad Street pump. It was a decisive, symbolic act, and the outbreak in that area almost immediately subsided. He is a great piece of historical trivia that adds a layer to the story, removing the pump handle didn't actually end the outbreak. Snow's own research showed that the epidemic was already waning by the time the handle was removed, as people were already fleeing the neighborhood. But the symbolic power of the act was immense. What did prove his case, in a sad and fascinating way, was a follow-up investigation. A later inquiry revealed that the well for the Broad Street pump had been dug just a few feet from an old, making cesspit, and that cesspit contained the waste from the very first victim of the Soho outbreak, a baby who had contracted cholera from another source. It was the perfect, grim proof of his theory: fecal-oral transmission. You would think this would be a watershed moment, a scientific hero, vindicated, but it wasn't. The medical establishment, led by the powerful Board of Health, reviewed Snow's evidence and dismissed it. They clung to the miasma theory, arguing that the contamination of the well was a coincidence, and the real cause was a foul smell from a nearby sewer grate. They were so committed to their theory that they simply couldn't see the evidence right in front of them. So as the Great Stink engulfed London in 1858, John Snow was a frustrated figure. He had the answer. He had the proof. But he was a voice in the wilderness. He watched the city spend a fortune dumping lime into the river and listened to MPs debate the smell in their chambers, knowing they were all aiming at the wrong target. Historians still debate why Snow's theory was so roundly rejected. Was it scientific conservatism, professional jealousy, or the simple, unpalatable fact that his theory implicated the powerful, private water companies who were drawing their water directly from the filthy Thames and selling it to Londoners? Tragically, John Snow would not live to see his theory vindicated. In a cruel twist of fate, just as the Great Stink was reaching its peak in June 1858, he suffered a stroke. He died a few days later, his life's most important work still largely unaccested. The city was choking on a problem he had solved years before, but his solution was buried under a mountain of fear, tradition, and bad science. While the politicians were gagging in their riverside palace and the scientists were arguing about smells, another, much older story was playing out across London: the story of the rich versus the poor. The Great Stink, like all great urban crises, wasn't an equal opportunity offender. It was a disaster that you could, to a certain extent, buy your way out of. And so began the great, panicked exodus of 1858. For the wealthy elites of Victorian London, the bankers, the industrialists, the aristocrats with homes in Mayfair and Belgravia, the city was a place of business and social display. But it wasn't necessarily home in the way we think of it. Many had sprawling country estates, tranquil green refuges far from the coal smoke and crowds of the capital. As the summer heatwave intensified and the stench became unbearable, the decision was simple: leave. You have to picture the scene. The grand squares of West London, usually bustling with the carriages of the fashionable, began to empty out. Families packed up their trunks, rounded up their children and servants, and decamped to the clean air of Surrey, Kent, or the increasingly popular seaside resorts like Brighton. The seasonal migration that normally happened in the peak heat of August was happening weeks earlier, and with a new sense of urgency. This wasn't a vacation, it was a retreat, a flight from an invading force. Letters and diaries from the period are filled with this sense of escape. A wife might to her sister, "We simply could not bear the air a moment longer." The doctor advised that the children, in particular, were at risk from the river poison. They framed it as a matter of health, a sensible precaution against the dreaded miasma. But it was also a matter of comfort and privilege. They could afford to leave, so they did. This exodus had a strange effect on the city. The West End became eerily quiet. The theatres and opera houses, which would normally be in full swing during the London season, saw their attendance plummet. High-end shops that catered to the gentry found their business drying up. The crisis was, in this sense, bad for business, at least, the business of luxury. But what about the vast majority of London's 2.5 million residents, the clerks, the shopkeepers, the factory workers, the labourers, the seamstresses. They had nowhere to go. For them, London wasn't a seasonal accessory, it was their entire world. They were tied to their jobs, their small rented rooms, their communities. Fleeing to the countryside wasn't an option. They were trapped. They had to stay and, quite literally, breathe it in. This brings us to one of the starkest social realities of the time. The very people who were most exposed to the worst of the pollution were the least able to escape it. The poorest Londoners lived in the low-lying, riverside districts like Southwark, Bermondsey, and Lambeth. These were the areas directly adjacent to the stinking mudflats. The areas with the worst sanitation, the most crowded housing, and the highest concentration of polluting industries. Their front yard was the open sewer of the Thames, and they were also the customers of the water companies that drew their supply from the most polluted parts of the river. They were living in, and drinking from, the epicenter of the crisis. There's a little known but poignant detail here about the water butts. In poor tenements, there was no running water to individual rooms. Instead, a building would have a single, large wooden barrel, or butt, in the yard or basement. This would be filled intermittently by the water company, and all the residents would use it for drinking, cooking, and washing. These butts were often uncovered, poorly maintained, and became breeding grounds for disease. So even if the water being piped in was contaminated, it became even more so by the time it was ladled out for use. This was a daily reality completely alien to the wealthy families who were now enjoying fresh air and clean well water on their country estates. Historians still debate the extent to which the great stink fueled genuine class resentment. The newspapers of the day were certainly full of anger. There was a strong sense that the government, composed of and catering to the wealthy, had neglected the basic needs of the city for years. The crisis was seen as a direct result of this neglect. While the rich could simply pack up and leave the mess behind, the working class was left to suffer the consequences of decisions they had no part in making. The stink was a physical manifestation of this social inequality. So as June turned into July, London became a tale of two cities. One was a ghost town of shuttered mansions and empty parks. The other was a sweltering, stinking, and increasingly angry metropolis, its people feeling abandoned and trapped. The flight of the rich didn't solve the problem, it just concentrated it. It left behind a core population of working people who were scared, disgusted, and looking for someone to blame. And the media was more than happy to help them point the finger. As the stench rose, so did the public's anger. And in Victorian Britain, when you wanted to channel public anger into sharp, witty, and devastatingly effective satire, you turned to one place, a magazine called Punch. In the summer of 1858, Punch and other illustrated papers became the primary chroniclers of the Great Stink, and they did it with a savagery that modern political cartoonists would envy. They didn't just report on the crisis, they gave it a face. They turned the polluted River Thames into a character, a monstrous, skeletal figure named Father Thames, rising from the muck to terrorize the city that had abused him. Imagine you're picking up the latest issue of Punch in early July. You flip through the pages of jokes and social commentary, and then you come to the centerpiece, a large, detailed wood-engraved cartoon. One of the most famous, published that month, is titled The Silent Highwayman. It depicts a skeletal Grim Reaper paddling a boat on a black, shilty river. His passenger is a terrified, ghost-like figure representing the city of London. The caption reads, "Your MONEY or your LIFE." It's a brilliant, multi-layered joke. It's a play on the term highwaymen, the robbers who used to plague Britain's roads. But here, the silent highway is the river itself, and the robber is death, spawned from the pollution, threatening the entire city. It perfectly captured the feeling that London was being held hostage by its own filth. Another iconic cartoon from the period is Father Thames introducing his offspring. Here, a filthy, bearded, and decrepit Father Thames, looking more like a monster from a swamp than a river god, is shown presenting his 3 children to a disgusted Britannia, the female personification of Britain. The children are not cherubs, they are hideous, goblin-like figures labeled diphtheria, SCR vula, and cholera. The message was brutally clear: the river isn't just dirty, it's a breeding ground for the very diseases that are killing your people. This cartoon was particularly effective because it directly challenged the miasma theory's vagueness. It didn't just say bad air causes sickness, it said this specific river is giving birth to these specific diseases. These cartoons were powerful because they were accessible. Not everyone in London could read the dense columns of text in the Times, but everyone could understand the visceral message of a picture. They saw their own disgust and fear reflected in these stark, black and white images. The cartoons gave them a villain to blame, not just the abstract concept of pollution, but the bumbling politicians and greedy water companies who were letting it happen. The artists didn't spare the politicians. Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was a frequent target. He was often drawn pinching his nose, looking weak and ineffective. The entire Metropolitan Board of Works was portrayed as a group of clueless buffoons, literally sitting in a cloud of stink, unable to decide what to do. The satire was relentless and it was working. It kept the pressure on, making it impossible for the government to simply wait for the smell to go away. Here's a lesser-known aspect of this media frenzy. It wasn't just the famous magazines like Punch do. The city was flooded with cheaper, often more radical, illustrated papers and penny broadsheets. These were the tabloids of their day, and they used the Great Stink to push a more aggressive political agenda. Their cartoons were ruder, their language more direct. They explicitly linked the filthy river to the suffering of the poor and the indifference of the rich, sometimes depicting the wealthy fleeing in their carriages while skeletal workers were chained to the riverbank. This underground press helped to solidify the idea that the Great Stink wasn't just a public health crisis, but a crisis of social justice. Historians still debate the precise influence of these satirical cartoons on policymaking. Did a single punch cartoon actually change an MP's vote? Probably not directly, but their cumulative effect was immense. They shaped public opinion in a way that dry, scientific reports never could. They created a political atmosphere where inaction was no longer an option. They made the Great Stink the story, and they framed it in a way that demanded a grand, heroic solution. The government couldn't just do a little patch-up job. The public was now primed for something epic, something that would slay the monster that Punch had so vividly brought to life. These cartoons were so effective that they have become the defining historical memory of the event. When we think of the Great Stink today, the images that often come to mind are not photographs, but these satirical drawings. They have outlasted the scientific theories and the political speeches of the day. They remind us that sometimes the most powerful way to fight a crisis is to mock it, to give it a silly, monstrous face, and to shame the powerful into finally taking action. The stage was now perfectly set. The public was angry, the politicians were desperate, and the media had created the demand for a hero. And right on cue, one was about to step forward. The city was choking. The politicians were panicking, and the newspapers were howling. London needed a hero. Not a knight in shining armor, but something far more practical, a man with a plan, a slide rule, and an unshakable belief in the power of bricks and mortar. That man was Joseph Bazalgette. If you were to cast him in a movie, you wouldn't pick a swashbuckling adventurer. You'd pick a quiet, determined character actor. Joseph Bazalgette was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, the very organization being mercilessly mocked in the press. He was 39 years old in 1858, a man in the prime of his career, with a reputation for being meticulous, hard-working, and perhaps a little obsessive. He wasn't a showman, he was an engineer's engineer. Bazalgette had been wrestling with London's sewage problem for years, long before it became a national crisis. He had joined the city's Commission of Sewers in 1849, the year of the second great cholera epidemic. He had seen the problem up close, studied the mess of old drains and overflowing cesspits, and knew that small fixes were useless. He was a man who thought in systems, not in patches. Even before the Great Stink, he had been drawing up plans for a radical solution. He had submitted proposals, argued in committees, and tried to convince the politicians that a massive, citywide overhaul was the only answer. But his plans were always dismissed as too ambitious, too expensive, too disruptive. The government at the time was famously resistant to large-scale public spending. They believed in private enterprise and minimal state intervention. The idea of spending millions of pounds on something as unglamorous as sewers was anathema to them. So Bazalgette waited, refining his plans, calculating his gradients, and biding his time. Then came the summer of 1858. The Great Stink was, for Bazalgette, a terrible crisis but also a golden opportunity. The stench that was sickening the city was the greatest argument for his cause he could have ever wished for. It achieved what his years of patient lobbying could not. It made the problem unavoidable and the need for a solution urgent. What set Bazalgette apart was the elegance and foresight of his vision. He wasn't just planning to build bigger sewers, he was planning to create a whole new, invisible river system underneath London. His core idea was simple but revolutionary: intercepting sewers. Instead of letting the hundreds of existing sewers dump their contents directly into the Thames within the city limits, he proposed building a small number of massive, new main sewers that would run parallel to the river. These interceptors would be built at a slight angle, so they would catch the flow from the old sewers and, using the gentle power of gravity, carry the waste far to the east, downstream of the city. It was a brilliant concept. It didn't require ripping up the entire existing sewer network. It simply co-opted it, redirecting its flow before it could reach the river. The waste of London would no longer be a London problem. It would be discharged into the Thames at Barking on the north bank and Crossness on the south, far enough downstream that the outgoing tide would then carry it harmlessly out into the North Sea. Here's a wonderfully nerdy, little-known detail that shows Bazalgette's genius. He was obsessed with getting the details right. When calculating the size of the main sewer pipes, he didn't just plan for the current population of London. He took the largest population density he could find anywhere in the city, assumed that one day the entire city would be that crowded, and then he said, "No, let's double it, just to be safe." This single, remarkably far-sighted decision is the reason his system continued to function for over 150 years, serving a city far larger than he could have ever imagined. He literally built in a massive just-in-case factor. But his plan was more than just big pipes. He incorporated pumping stations to lift the sewage from the low-lying areas up to the level of the main interceptors. He designed overflow systems for times of heavy rain. He meticulously planned the gradient of every tunnel to ensure a constant flow speed of about 2 miles per hour, fast enough to keep solids suspended and moving, but not so fast that it would cause excessive wear and tear on the brickwork. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a complete, self-regulating system. Historians still debate the extent to which Bazalgette's plan was entirely his own creation. He certainly built on the ideas of earlier sanitary reformers and engineers. Men like the painter John Martin had proposed similar, if more fantastical, schemes decades earlier. But it was Bazalgette who synthesized all the ideas, did the painstaking calculations, and created a practical, buildable blueprint. He was the one who translated a desperate need into a workable engineering solution. So while the MPs were fanning themselves with scented handkerchiefs, Joseph Bazalgette was unrolling his maps. He had the plan. He had the calculations. He had the vision. All he needed now was the political will and the money to make it happen. And thanks to the relentless, gag-inducing power of the Great Stink, both were about to be delivered to him on a silver platter. The British Parliament is an institution known for its deliberate, often glacial, pace. Bills can be debated for months, even years, getting bogged down in committee, amended into oblivion, or simply fading away. But in July 1858, Parliament did something extraordinary. Spurred on by an enemy it could smell from its own benches, it moved with a speed that was nothing short of miraculous. The story of the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act is a perfect example of how political will can materialize out of thin air when a crisis becomes personal. We left our MPs literally fleeing their committee rooms, choked by the stench. The government, led by Prime Minister Lord Derby and his Chancellor, Benjamin Disraeli, realized that they could no longer afford to prevaricate. The mocking headlines in the newspapers were one thing, but the complete shutdown of the legislative process was another. They had to act. On a blisteringly hot day in mid-July, Disraeli, the same man who had been seen fleeing the smell just weeks before, stood up in the House of Commons. In a speech that has become legendary, he introduced a bill to fund and empower the Metropolitan Board of Works to solve the sewage problem once and for all. He acknowledged the immense cost, but he famously declared that the issue was not just about smell, but about the health and honor of the country. It was a question, he argued, of whether London would be a metropolis of the world or a byword of reproach. It was a stunning reversal. Disraeli's own party, the Conservatives, were traditionally the party of low taxes and minimal government spending, yet here he was, proposing one of the largest and most expensive public works projects in the nation's history. But the great stink had changed the political calculus. The opposition Liberals, who might normally have fought such a spending bill, were just as desperate for a solution. For once, the entire House of Commons was in furious agreement on something: the smell had to go. The speed with which the bill moved through the system was breathtaking. Normally, a bill of this magnitude would be subject to endless scrutiny. But this one flew. The usual arguments about cost, about the rights of property owners whose land would be affected, about the precise engineering details, they all melted away in the face of the overwhelming stench. One MP reportedly said that they were legislating in a state of absolute terror. And so, the bill that gave Joseph Bazalgette the green light was passed in a flurry of activity. From its introduction to receiving royal assent, the final step, where the Queen signs it into law, the entire process took just 18 days. In the long, slow history of parliamentary democracy, this was the equivalent of a lightning strike. The Great Stink had achieved in less than a month what reformers had failed to do in decades. Here's a fascinating, and slightly cynical, detail about the politics of the bill. How did the government plan to pay for this colossal undertaking? The bill authorized the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow £3 million, a sum that would eventually be exceeded. To pay back this loan, they were empowered to levy a special new tax on all London households. This tax, a threepenny rate, would last for 40 years. In essence, the politicians, having finally been forced to act, passed the bill for their decades of neglect directly onto the citizens of London. It was a classic political maneuver: take credit for the grand solution, but make someone else pay for it. The bill did more than just provide the money. It gave Bazalgette and the Board of Works immense power. It allowed them to acquire land, to tunnel under private property, and to override the squabbling local parish councils that had so often stood in the way of progress. It was a centralized, authoritarian solution to a chaotic, decentralized problem. It effectively declared martial law on London's sewage. Historians still debate whether this rapid-fire legislation was a moment of enlightened governance, or simply a knee-jerk reaction born of panic. Was it a testament to the flexibility of the British Constitution, or a sign that politicians only act when a crisis directly affects their own comfort and well-being? The truth is likely somewhere in between. It was a profoundly pragmatic moment. The theoretical arguments about laissez-faire economics and local governance were important, but the reality of a river of filth lapping at the foundations of Parliament was more compelling. With the bill passed and the money secured, the ball was now firmly in Joseph Bazalgette's court. The politicians had done their part. Driven by desperation, they had, in essence, written him a blank check and said, "Fix this. We don't care how. Just make the smell go away." For Bazalgette, who had been waiting in the wings with his meticulous plans, it was the moment his entire professional life had been leading up to. The great, stinking problem now had a great, funded solution. The time for drawing was over. The time for digging was about to begin. With the 18-day miracle bill passed and a mountain of money at his disposal, Joseph Bazalgette could finally unroll his great blueprint and turn it into reality. His plan wasn't just a proposal for a new sewer, it was a radical reimagining of the city's relationship with its own waste. It was elegant, audacious, and on a scale that London had never seen before. Let's get our hands dirty and dive into the genius of the design. Picture London as a shallow basin, with the Thames running through its lowest point. On both the north and south sides of the river, the land gently slopes down towards the water. For centuries, this simple geography dictated the flow of everything: rainwater, streams, and eventually sewage all ran downhill, straight into the river. Bazalgette's plan was to defy this natural flow, as we've touched on. His key innovation was the intercepting sewer. He designed a series of 5 enormous, brick-lined tunnels, 3 on the more populous north side of the Thames and 2 on the south. These were not your average sewers. These were underground boulevards. The main ones were over 11 feet in diameter, large enough to drive a bus through. These 5 interceptors would be laid out running from west to east, parallel to the river, but with a very gentle, carefully calculated downward slope. On the north side, for example, there was a high-level sewer, a middle-level sewer, and a low-level sewer. The high-level sewer would catch the waste from the hilly suburbs like Hampstead and Highgate. The middle level would serve the central part of the city, and the low level would handle the areas right on the riverbank. Each existing neighborhood sewer, which used to point directly at the Thames, would now flow into one of these new, massive intercepting tunnels. It was like building a new superhighway that all the old country lanes fed into. The real genius was in the gradient. Bazalgette calculated that a drop of just 2 feet for every mile of tunnel would create a flow of around 2.5 miles per hour. This was the magic speed. It was fast enough to keep the solid waste suspended in the water, preventing it from settling and creating blockages, a problem that had plagued the old sewers. But it was also slow enough that it wouldn't cause a torrent that could erode the brickwork over time. It was a perfect, self-cleaning velocity, all powered by the simple, free, and utterly reliable force of gravity. But what about the areas that were so low-lying they were actually below the level of the Thames at high tide? Gravity couldn't help you. For these problem spots, Bazalgette incorporated one of the most visible and impressive parts of his system: the pumping stations. At key points, like Abbey Mills in the east and on the Chelsea embankment, he designed colossal, steam-powered pumping stations. These engines, the most powerful of their kind in the world, would act as giant hulls for the system, lifting the sewage from the low-level sewers up into the main outfall tunnels that carried the waste to its final destination. And here's a wonderfully quirky detail that reveals the Victorian mindset. Bazalgette didn't just design functional industrial buildings. He designed palaces. The Abbey Mills pumping station, in particular, is a masterpiece of ornate Victorian architecture, with its intricate ironwork, polished granite columns, and soaring, church-like central octagon. It was nicknamed the Cathedral of Sewage. This wasn't just vanity. It was a statement. It was the Victorians showing their immense pride in their engineering prowess. They believed that even a building designed to handle human waste should be a monument to human ingenuity and, in its own way, beautiful. They were so proud of conquering filth that they built a temple to celebrate it. The final piece of the puzzle was the discharge point. The plan was to collect all the sewage from the entire city and funnel it to 2 main outfalls: Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south. These were far to the east of London, beyond the main population centres. And here, Bazalgette incorporated another clever trick using the power of nature. The sewage wasn't just dumped into the river continuously. It was held in huge, underground reservoirs. Then, on the high tide, the gates were closed. They would wait until the tide began to ebb. And then, about 2 hours after high tide, they would open the floodgates. The enormous volume of collected sewage would be released into the powerful, outgoing current, which would whisk it far out into the Thames estuary and towards the North Sea. It was a brilliant use of the river's own tidal rhythm to do the final job of disposal. Historians and engineers still marvel at the comprehensive nature of Bazalgette's blueprint. There's a debate about whether he anticipated every single challenge from the outset, or if the plan evolved significantly during construction. Evidence suggests a bit of both. He was a pragmatic engineer who was willing to adapt his designs when faced with unforeseen geological problems. But the core concept, the intercepting sewers, the pumping stations, and the tidal discharge was all there from the beginning. It was a complete, holistic vision for a cleaner city, a blueprint not just for sanitation, but for the future health and growth of London itself. With the blueprint approved and the money flowing, London was about to become the biggest construction site in the world. The Great Stink had triggered the Great Dig, starting in 1859. Joseph Bazalgette's grand design began to move from paper to reality, and the city's streets were turned upside down to create a new world underneath them. Imagine the scene. This wasn't a tidy, fenced-off construction project in an empty field. This was happening in the heart of one of the busiest, most crowded cities on the planet. To build the new intercepting sewers, huge trenches had to be dug, some of them 40 feet deep and 20 feet wide, running right down the middle of major thoroughfares, streets that were already choked with horse-drawn omnibuses, delivery carts, and pedestrians were now impassable, replaced by vast, muddy chests. The primary method of construction was cut and cover. This is exactly what it sounds like. You dig a massive trench from the surface, build the brick sewer tunnel at the bottom of it, and then cover it all back up again. It was brutally effective, but also incredibly disruptive. The noise was constant, the rhythmic clang of pickaxes against stone, the shouting of foremen, the creak of wooden cranes lifting tons of earth, and the rumble of thousands of carts hauling away the spoil. Londoners had complained about the stink, now they complained about the noise, the dust, and the chaos. Entire neighborhoods were transformed. In some places, whole rows of buildings had to be demolished to make way for the trenches. The project paid out huge sums in compensation to property owners. But for the people living and working alongside these massive earthworks, life became a daily struggle. Their shops were cut off from customers, the foundations of their homes were shaken by the digging, and the air was thick with brick dust and grime. One of the most ambitious and visible parts of the project was the creation of the new river embankments on the north side of the Thames. Bazalgette combined the construction of his low-level sewer with a massive land reclamation project. Instead of digging a trench through the maze of narrow, ancient riverside streets, he built a new, solid granite wall out in the river itself, backfilled the space behind it with earth, and laid his sewer inside this newly created land. This brilliant move killed two birds with one stone. It provided a clear, unobstructed path for his most difficult sewer line, and it created new, valuable real estate and a grand public thoroughfare, the Victoria Embankment. The same was done on the south side, creating the Albert Embankment, and in Chelsea. This is where you find a fascinating little piece of hidden history. The next time you walk along the Victoria Embankment in London, look at the ornate cast iron benches. They are decorated with sphinxes and camels, a nod to the Egyptian theme popular at the time. But look closer at the armrests. They are designed in the shape of a dolphin's body, but its tail is curled up onto its back. This was supposedly a subtle, inside joke by the designers. The dolphins' tails were curved upwards because the fish in the Thames had been so starved of oxygen for so long that they were often seen gasping at the surface. Their bodies contorted. It's a small, dark, and witty memorial to the very pollution the project was designed to eliminate. Hidden in plain sight. The scale of the operation was mind-boggling. Over the course of the project, they would excavate more than 3.5 million cubic yards of earth. That's enough to fill the Great Pyramid of Giza. To build the 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, they used 318 million bricks. That's enough bricks to build a wall 6 feet high from London to Moscow. They also used a vast quantity of a relatively new and miraculous building material, Portland cement. This hydraulic cement could set and harden even underwater, which made it absolutely essential for building strong, watertight tunnels in London's marshy, waterlogged soil. Historians and urban planners still debate the long-term consequences of the cut-and-cover method, while it was the only viable technology at the time for such large tunnels. The disruption it caused was immense and it permanently altered the layout of some parts of the city. The later development of tunnel boring machines, like those used to dig the London Underground, would allow for far less intrusive subterranean construction. Bazalgette's project was, in many ways, the last great hurrah of this brute force, top-down approach to engineering. So, for the better part of a decade, London lived with this open-heart surgery. It was a city of trenches, cranes, and mountains of dirt. The immediate problem of the stink had been replaced by the more tangible problems of construction. But underneath the chaos, something incredible was taking shape. A new, secret river system, built of millions of bricks and powered by gravity, was slowly but surely stretching its tentacles out beneath the city, ready to capture the filth and restore the health of the metropolis above. The vision was grand, but its realization depended entirely on the men working in the mud at the bottom of those trenches. While Joseph Bazalgette was the celebrated mind behind the Great Sewer Project, the men who actually built it were the unsung heroes of the story. They were the Nervis, a formidable class of manual laborers who were the muscle behind Britain's industrial revolution. And their work in the tunnels beneath London was some of the most difficult and dangerous of the era. The term Navvy is a shortened form of navigator, a name originally given to the men who dug the navigation canals in the 18th century. By the mid-19th century, it referred to the hardened, itinerant workers who built the railways, bridges, and tunnels that transformed the country. They were a distinct group, known for their incredible physical strength, their prodigious appetite for food and beer, and their fiercely independent, often rowdy, nature. Imagine being one of these men. Your workday begins at dawn. You descend into a deep, muddy trench or a freshly dug tunnel, the air cool and damp. Your tools are simple and heavier per cost. A shovel, a wheelbarrow. The work is relentless. Back-breaking manual labor. You are not just digging through soft soil. You are breaking up rock, hewing through clay, and constantly battling the ingress of water from London's marshy ground. The sheer physical output was staggering. A typical Navvy was expected to shift about 20 tons of earth in a single 10-hour shift. That's the equivalent of shoveling the weight of 3 adult male elephants every single day. They were paid relatively well for the time, but it was piecework, meaning they were paid by the cubic yard of earth moved. This created a fiercely competitive and punishingly fast pace. There was no time for slacking. The conditions were appalling. In the cut-and-cover trenches, you were exposed to the elements, the rain, the cold, and in the summer, the relentless sun. But the most dangerous work was in the actual tunneling, where sections of the sewer had to be bored through the ground without breaking the surface. Here, you worked by the dim, flickering light of candles or oil lamps, the air thick with smoke and the dust from the digging. This is where we find one of the most terrifying hazards of the job: tunnel collapses. The ground beneath London is a complex mix of gravel, sand, and clay. The Nervis became expert practical geologists, learning to read the soil and shore up the tunnels with massive timber frames as they went. But sometimes, the ground would shift unexpectedly. A section of tunnel could collapse with little warning, burying men under tons of earth. And then there was the gas. The ground, saturated with centuries of leaking cesspit waste, was full of trapped methane. A misplaced picask striking a pocket of this fire damp could cause a devastating explosion when ignited by a candle flame. There were also pockets of toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide, the very smell of the great stink, which could asphyxiate a man in minutes in a confined space. It was a constant, invisible threat. Here's a small but fascinating detail about the Nervis culture. To cope with the immense physical demands of their work, they consumed a colossal amount of food and drink. A Nervis daily diet might consist of several pounds of beef or bacon, huge loaves of bread, and a gallon or more of beer. This wasn't just for leisure, it was fuel. The calories they burned in a day were astronomical. Their temporary camps, set up near the major construction sites, were legendary for their raucous pubs and boisterous social life. Despite their vital role, the navvies were often viewed with suspicion and fear by the settled London population. They were seen as outsiders, a roughened, godless bunch. But they had their own strong code of honor and camaraderie, forged in the shared danger of the tunnels. When a man was injured or killed, his fellow workers would always pass the hat to raise money for his family. The historical record on the exact number of casualties during the construction of the London sewers is still a matter of some debate. Record-keeping for labouring class deaths was notoriously poor, while Bazalgette's project was considered remarkably safe for its time, thanks to his insistence on high-quality materials and careful engineering. Accidents were still tragically common. Estimates vary, but it's certain that dozens, if not hundreds, of men lost their lives to tunnel collapses, explosions, and disease during the years of construction. They were the forgotten casualties in the war against filth. So as you picture those grand, perfectly formed brick tunnels lying silently beneath London today, remember that every single brick was laid by hand. Every foot of earth was moved by human muscle. These tunnels weren't just an engineering marvel, they were a monument to the thousands of anonymous navvies who risked their lives, who risked their lives, who risked their lives. Damp and dangerous underworld, slowly but surely building the arteries of a new, cleaner city. While the navvies toiled in the muddy darkness of the tunnels, another, more glamorous part of Bazalgette's system was rising above ground. These were the great pumping stations, the muscular hearts of the new sewer network, and they weren't designed to be hidden away. They were built to be seen, to be admired, and to stand as magnificent monuments to the triumph of Victorian engineering over urban squalor. The grandest of them all, the undisputed king, was the Crossness pumping station. Located on the south bank of the Thames at a marshy, remote spot called Crossness, this was the final collection point for all of South London's sewage before it was discharged into the river. Its job was to lift the sewage from the low-level sewers, a staggering 30 to 40 feet, into the main outfall reservoir. To do this, Bazalgette needed power on an unprecedented scale. He commissioned 4 of the largest steam engines in the world, named Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra after the royal family. These were rotor beam engines, giants of iron in breasts. Each engine had a massive, 40-foot-long overhead beam that rocked up and down like a giant seesaw, powered by steam from a bank of boilers. This beam, in turn, drove a colossal flywheel that was 27 feet in diameter and weighed over 50 tons. The smooth, relentless power of these spinning flywheels drove the pumps that lifted millions of gallons of sewage every day. But the truly astonishing thing about Crossness wasn't just its function, it was its form. When you step inside the main engine house, you don't feel like you're in an industrial building. You feel like you're in a cathedral. Bazalgette and his architect, Charles Driver, let their imaginations run wild. The entire building is a riot of ornate, decorative cast iron. The columns that support the roof blossom into intricate floor capitals. The spiral staircases are delicate works of art. The balustrades and railings are adorned with elaborate patterns of vines and flowers. Every surface is painted in rich, vibrant colors, deep reds, greens, and blues, all highlighted with gold leaf. It is, without a doubt, the most beautiful building ever designed for the purpose of pumping poo. This has led to it being nicknamed the Cathedral of Sewage, and it's a perfect description. This extravagance wasn't just a flight of fancy, it was a powerful statement of civic pride. The Victorians saw engineering as a heroic, almost divine, calling. They had conquered nature, tamed the filth of a great city, and they wanted to celebrate it. They believed that functional things should also be beautiful, that the infrastructure that served the public should also inspire them. They didn't see a contradiction between a sewage pump and a floral motif. To them, Both were expressions of a divinely ordered, man-made world. Here's a wonderful, little-known detail about the construction. The sheer weight of the engines and the building itself posed a massive problem, as it was all being built on unstable marshland. To create a solid foundation, Bazalgette's team had to doctor thousands of wooden piles deep into the ground. But before they did that, they laid a foundation raft made of a thick layer of a revolutionary new material, concrete. The use of mass concrete on this scale was still relatively new and experimental. Crossness was one of the earliest and most successful examples of its use in a major civil engineering project, a quiet innovation hidden beneath all the decorative ironwork. The opening of the Crossness pumping station in April 1865 was a huge public event. The Prince of Wales himself, the future King Edward VII, came to perform the ceremony. There was a grand banquet held inside the not yet operational engine house, with speeches praising Bazalgette and the triumph of modern science. It was the ultimate vindication. The problem that had caused the great stink was now being solved by a machine so grand, so powerful, and so beautiful that it warranted a royal celebration. Architectural historians still debate the precise style of these palaces of Pooh. Is it High Victorian Gothic Italianate or something else entirely? A unique style that could be called industrial exuberance? There's no easy answer. They were a fusion of different influences, all united by a single goal: to make the invisible infrastructure of the city visible, and to make it glorious. Similar, though slightly less ornate, pumping stations were built at other key locations, like Abbey Mills on the North Bank, which has an even more Byzantine, church-like design, and a smaller station hidden beneath the new Victoria Embankment in the city centre. Together, they formed a network of power, lifting London's waste against the pull of gravity, ensuring that the whole system flowed smoothly towards its final destination. They were the noisy, stormy, magnificent engine rooms of London's new subterranean landscape. Bazalgette's grand design of intercepting sewers and palatial pumping stations was a masterpiece of vision and scale. But none of it would have been possible without a humble, grey, and utterly revolutionary powder Portland cement. This miracle material was the glue that held the entire colossal project together, and its use on such a massive scale marked a turning point in the history of construction. Before the mid-19th century, the standard mortar used for bricklaying was made from lime and sand. This lime mortar was perfectly adequate for building houses and walls above ground, but it had a fatal flaw: it was not hydraulic. This means it wouldn't set properly in wet conditions and would slowly disintegrate if it was constantly exposed to water. For a project that involved building 82 miles of watertight tunnels deep within London's soggy, waterlogged clay, lime mortar was a non-starter. Bazalgette needed something stronger, something more durable, something that actually thrived in the damp. He found his answer in Portland cement. It had been invented a few decades earlier, in 1824, by an English bricklayer named Joseph A. S.P.D. Inn. He created it by heating a precise mixture of limestone and clay to extremely high temperatures until it formed a hard substance called clinker, which was then ground into a fine powder. When mixed with water and sand, this powder formed a mortar or concrete that was not only incredibly strong but was also hydraulic. It could sit and harden underwater, and it was far more resistant to erosion and chemical attack. ISPD and named it Portland cement because the hardened concrete resembled the color of Portland stone, a prestigious building stone quarried on the Isle of Portland. In the early days, Portland cement was a niche, expensive product. Its manufacturing process was inconsistent, and builders were often skeptical of new materials. But by the 1850s, the quality control had improved dramatically, and engineers were beginning to realize its incredible potential. Bazalgette was one of its most enthusiastic and influential champions. He recognized that it was the only material that could guarantee the long-term integrity of his sewer tunnels. He made a crucial and uncompromising decision: every single one of the 318 million bricks used in the main sewers would be bonded with mortar made from Portland cement. This was, at the time, the largest order for cement in history. It kick-started the British cement industry, with new factories being built along the Thames estuary to meet the unprecedented demand from the sewer project. The use of this superior mortar had a profound impact on the quality and longevity of the tunnels. The navvies became skilled in working with it, creating brickwork of a standard that is rarely seen today. The tunnels were typically constructed with multiple layers of brick, all perfectly bonded, creating a structure that was not just a pipe, but a solid, monolithic too, immensely strong and almost completely impermeable. This is why, when you see photos from inside Bazalgette's sewers today, the brickwork looks so crisp and solid after more than 150 years of continuous use. Here's a great little technical detail for the engineering nerds out there. Bazalgette and his team conducted rigorous quality control tests on the cement they received. They would create sample blocks of mortar and test their tensile strength, their ability to resist being pulled apart. They had a policy of rejecting any batch of cement that didn't meet their exacting standards. This relentless focus on material quality was a hallmark of Bazalgette's management style and a key reason for the project's enduring success. He knew that the parts of the system that no one would ever see had to be the strongest. The success of Portland cement in the sewers had a massive ripple effect. Engineers and architects across the world saw what it could do. Its use in the London project was a huge, high-profile demonstration of its strength and reliability. It helped to launch the age of concrete within a few decades. This once niche material would be used to build everything from dams and bridges to skyscrapers. The humble grey powder that sealed London's sewers went on to become the most widely used building material in the world. Historians of technology still debate whether the sewer project was the cause or the effect of the rise of Portland cement. Did Bazalgette's demand create the modern cement industry? Or was the industry's maturation what made his project possible in the first place? The most likely answer is that it was a symbiotic relationship. The availability of increasingly reliable cement made the grand sewer plan feasible, and the sewer plan's massive demand, in turn, spurred the industry to innovate and scale up its production. So while the navvies provided the muscle and Bazalgette provided the brain, this unassuming grey powder provided the strength. It was the silent, chemical partner in the whole enterprise. It ensured that the great subterranean rivers being built beneath London wouldn't leak. It was the material secret to turning a brilliant idea into an enduring reality. So the waste from 2.5 million people has been successfully intercepted. It's flowing dutifully through miles of new, impeccably built brick tunnels. The great steam-powered hearts of the system are lifting it over obstacles. But this just leads to the final, crucial question: where does it all go? You can't just move a problem from one place to another. You need an endpoint. Bazalgette's solution was elegant, massive, and relied on harnessing the most powerful natural force available to him, the tide. The entire system was designed to funnel London's waste to two specific locations, far to the east of the city's main residential and commercial centres, on the north side of the Thames. The outfall was at a place called Beckton, on the south side. It was at Crossness, home of the Cathedral of Sewage. At these 2 points, Bazalgette constructed something that was, in its own way, as impressive as the tunnels themselves: colossal underground reservoirs. The Crossness Reservoir, for example, covered an area of over 6 acres and could hold 25 million gallons of sewage. Think of it as a vast, subterranean lake, a holding pen for the city's daily output. It was covered with a vaulted brick roof, which was then turfed over with grass, so from the surface, it was just a gentle green hill. The purpose of these reservoirs was all about timing. If you were to simply dump the sewage into the Thames continuously, 24 hours a day, you would run into a serious problem. The Thames is a tidal river. For about half the day, the tide is coming in the flood tide, and for the other half, it's going out the ebb tide. If you discharged the sewage during the flood tide, the powerful incoming current would pick it up and carry it right back upstream, defeating the entire purpose of the system. You would have spent millions of pounds just to move the problem a few miles down the road, only to have it delivered back to you a few hours later. Bazalgette's plan was far more cunning. He would use the reservoirs to play a waiting game with the river. As the sewage flowed in from the city, it would fill up these huge holding tanks. The discharge sluices, the giant gates connecting the reservoir to the river, would remain firmly shut. They would wait through the entire flood tide, letting the sewage accumulate. Then, once the tide turned and began to ebb, they would continue to wait. Bazalgette's calculations had shown that the most powerful outward flow occurred about 2 hours after high tide. This was the sweet spot. At this precise moment, the command would be given, and the giant sluice gates would be opened. The enormous, pent-up volume of sewage would be released in a controlled torrent, a man-made river rejoining a natural one. This massive discharge, hitting the river at the peak of its outgoing velocity, would be whisked away with unstoppable force, carried far down the Thames estuary and out into the vast, open expanse of the North Sea. It was a brilliant piece of environmental judo, using the river's own strength to solve the problem. The system was, in essence, giving the Thames a single, powerful laxative dosed twice a day, ensuring that the waste was carried so far out to sea that it could never trouble London again. Here's a small but vivid detail that captures the sheer power of this operation. The outflow channels where the sewage met the river were known as the Dragon's Mouth when the sluices were opened. The force of the discharging liquid was so immense that it would churn the river into a turbulent, foaming cauldron. It was a spectacle of controlled power, a daily demonstration of the city finally mastering its own effluent. This solution, however, was not without its critics. Even at the time, some people were concerned about the environmental impact of dumping such a vast quantity of raw sewage into the estuary. They worried about the effect on coastal towns and fishing grounds further down the coast. For decades, a bizarre and rather disgusting phenomenon occurred: the formation of a sewage-flecked shoreline on the beaches of Southend-on-Sea. A popular resort town, the Victorians, in solving their own problem, had effectively exported it downstream. Environmental historians are still debating the long-term ecological consequences of Bazalgette's outfall strategy. In the short term, it was an unqualified success for London, but it was based on the 19th century belief that the solution to pollution is dilution. The sea was seen as an infinitely large dumping ground, capable of absorbing anything humanity could throw into it. We now know that this is not true, and the practice of dumping raw sewage into the sea has since been abandoned in favor of sophisticated treatment plants. But for its time, Bazalgette's system was a revolutionary leap forward. It represented the final step in his grand plan. The waste was captured, transported, lifted, and finally, intelligently and strategically, disposed of. The loop was closed. The great machine was complete. All that remained was to see if it actually worked. The construction had taken the better part of a decade. It had been a period of immense disruption, noise, and expense. Londoners had traded a great stink for a great dig, but by the mid-1860s, the main sections of Bazalgette's masterpiece were complete and ready to be switched on. The city held its breath, waiting to see if this colossal investment would actually pay off. The result was not gradual. It was immediate, dramatic, and a profound relief to the senses. Imagine you are that same Londoner who, in 1858, had to keep your windows shut tight against the foul air. It's now, say, the summer of 1866. The new sewer system is operational. You cautiously open your window on a warm day. You take a breath, and what you smell is nothing. Rather, you smell the normal, everyday smells of a city called smoke, horses, street food, but the oppressive, gut-wrenching, underlying stench of the river is gone. It has vanished. The effect on the River Thames itself was nothing short of miraculous. For the first time in a generation, the water began to lose its foul, opaque brown color, as the constant influx of raw sewage was diverted into the new intercepting tunnels. The river could finally begin its own slow process of healing. The tides could once again do their work of flushing and cleansing, rather than just swishing filth back and forth. The stinking mudflats that had cooked in the summer sun began to be washed clean. The change was so noticeable that it became a topic of conversation and celebration. People started taking boat trips on the Thames again, not as a grim necessity, but for pleasure. The river was no longer a source of terror, but a source of recreation. There are even optimistic, though perhaps exaggerated, reports from the late 1860 seconds and 1870 seconds of fish being spotted in the central London Thames for the first time in decades. The return of life to the river was the ultimate sign that the poison had been removed. This newfound freshness had a profound psychological effect on the city. The miasma-induced terror that had gripped London during the Great Stink began to fade. People were no longer living in constant fear of the air they breathed. The very atmosphere of the city felt lighter, cleaner, more optimistic. The newspapers that had once published cartoons of a skeletal Father Thames now ran triumphant articles praising the genius of British engineering. Joseph Bazalgette, once a backroom engineer, became a national hero. He was lauded in the press, celebrated by politicians, and would eventually be knighted by Queen Victoria for his services to the city. He had delivered on his promise. He had made the smell go away. Here's a small, charming detail that illustrates the public's newfound affection for their sewer system. The grand opening of the Victoria Embankment in 1870 was a major public celebration. This new, sweeping boulevard, built on land reclaimed from the river and housing one of Bazalgette's main sewers, was seen as a symbol of the new London. It was a place of leisure, with trees and public gardens, where once there had been only stinking mud and dilapidated wharves. It transformed the riverside from a place of industry and filth into a civic showpiece. The sewer, hidden beneath, had made the beauty on the surface possible. Of course, not everything was perfect. The system was a marvel, but it wasn't magic. On days of exceptionally heavy rainfall, the sheer volume of stormwater could overwhelm the intercepting sewers to prevent the water from backing up and flooding people's homes. Bazalgette had designed overflow outlets that would allow the excess, heavily diluted sewage to discharge directly into the Thames. So, on rare occasions, the river would still suffer from pollution. But these events were few and far between, a world away from the constant, daily deluge of the past. Historians and sociologists are still studying the immense civic pride that the sewer project generated. It wasn't just about clean air. It was a statement about what kind of city London wanted to be. In an age of often chaotic and brutal industrialization, the sewer system was proof that humanity could use technology and large-scale planning to solve the problems it created. It was a triumph of order over chaos, of public good over private neglect. It showed that a modern, industrial city could also be a healthy, livable city. The citizens of London had paid for the system through their taxes. They had endured the years of disruption, and now they were reaping the rewards. They had taken the first, most important breath of fresh air in a generation. But the biggest, most life-saving benefit of their new, clean city was one that most of them, including Bazalgette himself, had never even intended. The primary goal of Bazalgette's grand project was to solve the problem of the smell. The entire £3 million enterprise. The 18-day miracle bill. The years of digging it was all motivated by the miasma theory. It was a war against a bad odor, which everyone believed was the direct cause of disease. The ultimate, life-saving triumph of the new sewer system was, therefore, a complete and glorious accident. Shortly after the main intercepting sewers became operational in the mid-1860 seconds, a final, deadly echo of the old London appeared. In 1866, an outbreak of cholera hit a specific area in the East End of London. It was a terrifying reminder of the past, and for the supporters of the miasma theory, it was deeply confusing. The river was cleaner than ever. The Great Stink was gone, so why was cholera back? This outbreak provided the perfect, tragic natural experiment to finally prove who had been right all along. The affected area in the East End was, by a quirk of fate, one of the few parts of London that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new system. The residents there were still being supplied with water by the East London Water Company, which was drawing its water from a reservoir that had been contaminated by a nearby leaking sewer. The results were stark and undeniable. In the parts of London served by the new, clean system and supplied with water drawn from further up the Thames, there were virtually no cases of cholera. In the small, unconnected pocket of the East End, thousands fell sick and over 500 people died. The disease wasn't in the air, it was in the water. The outbreak stopped almost immediately once the contaminated water source was cut off. This was the final, brutal piece of evidence that John Snow had been right all along. He had died in 1858, just before his theories would be so spectacularly vindicated. The Great Sewer System, built to eliminate an airborne threat that never existed, had accidentally eliminated the real threat by preventing the contamination of the city's main water source, the Thames. By cleaning up the river, Bazalgette had inadvertently cleaned up the drinking water. He had set out to build a giant air freshener and had accidentally built one of the most effective public health interventions in human history. The impact on the city's health was revolutionary. The death rate from cholera in London plummeted to near zero. It has never returned as an epidemic-level threat to the city. But the benefits didn't stop there. Other waterborne diseases that had plagued London for centuries, like typhoid and dysentery, also saw a dramatic and sustained decline. The overall mortality rate of the city, which had been stubbornly high throughout the first half of the 19th century, began a steady and permanent fall. Here's a small but profound detail that puts this achievement in perspective. For most of its history, London had been what historians call a demographic sink. This means that the death rate was so high that the city's population could only grow through constant migration from the countryside. More people died in London each year than were born there. Bazalgette's sewers helped to change that forever. By the end of the 19th century, for the first time in its long history, London became a self-sustaining city, where births finally outnumbered deaths. The sewers didn't just stop people from dying, they allowed the city to truly live and grow on its own. This accidental victory had a massive global impact. The London model of a comprehensive, citywide sewer system became the gold standard for public health engineering around the world. Cities from Paris to Boston to Hamburg sent their engineers to London to study Bazalgette's creation. The link between clean water, effective sanitation, and public health was now irrefutably proven. The focus of sanitary reform shifted decisively from the air to the water, from miasma to microbes. The scientific community's final acceptance of the germ theory of disease is a complex story that unfolded over several decades. But the London cholera experiment of 1866 was a crucial turning point. It was a real-world demonstration on a massive scale. It's one of history's great ironies. A project built on a completely flawed scientific premise ended up being the ultimate proof of the correct one. The miasma theory had been a useful lie, a falsehood so powerful and so terrifying that it motivated a city to spend a fortune on a solution that worked for reasons no one understood at the time. Bazalgette and his team had set out to cure a symptom, the smell. In doing so, they had accidentally cured the disease. It was perhaps the most successful and life-saving mistake in the history of medicine and engineering. A cleaner, healthier, and sweeter-smelling city had been achieved. But progress on this scale never comes for free. The great stink was gone, but the great bill had arrived. The final price tag for Bazalgette's masterpiece was a subject of immense public interest and, for some, considerable grumbling. The initial budget for the project, authorised by that frantic Act of Parliament in 1858, was £3 million. In the context of the mid-19th century, this was an astronomical sum. To put it in perspective, the iconic new Houses of Parliament, the very building the stink had terrorised, had cost around £2 million to build. The government was, in essence, willing to spend 1.5 times the cost of its seat of power just to fix its plumbing. But as is often the case with massive infrastructure projects, the initial budget was optimistic. The construction took longer and was more complex than anyone had anticipated. The cost of labor, materials, and, crucially, the compensation paid to landowners whose property was disrupted or demolished, all added up. By the time the project was fully completed in the 1872, the final cost had ballooned to over £6.50 million in today's money. That's a figure well into the billions. It was, without a doubt, the most expensive civic project the world had ever seen. So who paid for it? The answer was simple: the people of London. The government, in its haste to solve the problem, had set up a clever financing scheme. They authorized the Metropolitan Board of Works to levy a special tax, a rate of 3 pence in the pound on the assessed rental value of every single property in the London metropolitan area. This main drainage rate was a surcharge added to the regular property taxes of every household, from the grandest mansion in Mayfair to the smallest tenement room in the East End. This tax was set to run for 40 years, from 1859 to 1899, to pay off the massive loans the board had taken out. For the average Londoner, it wasn't a crippling amount, but it was a noticeable and constant reminder of the price of clean air. For 4 decades, every time a Londoner paid their rent or taxes, a small portion of it was going towards those magnificent brick tunnels and pumping stations. This, of course, led to some public debate and discontent. While most people were overjoyed with the results, there were always those who felt the cost was too high. The newspapers, which had once clamored for action at any price, now sometimes published letters to the editor complaining about the sewer tax. Shopkeepers and small business owners, in particular, felt the pinch. They argued that they had to bear the cost of a project that benefited the entire nation's capital. Here's a little-known detail that highlights the financial complexities. Bazalgette's board was constantly in negotiation, and sometimes in court, with other powerful entities. The old, private water companies, for instance, had to have their pipes rerouted. The newly developing railway companies had to coordinate their own tunnel and bridge construction with the sewer works. These negotiations were often tense, involving complex financial settlements. The final £6.50 million bill wasn't just for bricks and labour, it was for a mountain of legal fees and compensation payments. Historians of economics and public policy are still fascinated by the financing of the London sewers. It is often cited as a landmark case of successful long-term public investment. The decision to fund the project through a dedicated, long-term, and widely distributed tax was key to its success. It provided a steady and reliable stream of income, allowing the project to proceed without the constant political battles over annual funding that can plague modern infrastructure projects. It was a model of the user pays principle, where the beneficiaries of the system, the citizens of London, bore its cost over a reasonable period. Despite the grumbling, there was a general acceptance that it was money well spent. The economic benefits, though hard to quantify, were enormous. A healthier city meant a more productive workforce. The new embankments created prime real estate land and improved transportation. The dramatic fall in death rates saved countless lives, a value that can't be measured in pounds and shillings. The project was not a cost, it was an investment, and the return was the very health and modernity of London itself. The story of the sewer's price tag is a reminder that there's no magic wand for fixing big problems. The solution to the Great Stink required not just engineering genius, but also financial innovation and the collective will of a city's population to pay for their own salvation. They had bought themselves a cleaner future, 1 3-penny tax at a time. The sewers were built, the river was clean, and the city was healthy. But what became of the man at the center of it all? What was the final legacy of Joseph Bazalgette, the quiet engineer who had saved London from itself? His story, after the Great Stink, is one of continued, relentless work and, ultimately, a legacy of brick and mortar that would outlast almost any other monument of his time. Bazalgette didn't just pack up his slide rule and retire after the main sewer project was completed. The success of the Great Stink solution had turned him into the most trusted and powerful engineer in the country. He remained the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works for another 30 years, and in that time, he fundamentally reshaped the city of London. His work on the embankments Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea was almost as transformative as the sewers themselves. These weren't just covers for his tunnels, they were grand civic improvements. They provided flood defenses, created beautiful public parks and promenades where there had once been slums and mud, and eased traffic congestion with new, wide roads. He was also responsible for laying out new streets to cut through the congested heart of the city, like Charing Cross Road and Shaftesbury Avenue, which still form key arteries of London's West End. He was also a bridge builder. He designed and built new bridges across the Thames at Putney and Battersea, and he strengthened and widened the one at Hammersmith. His work was everywhere, often hidden but always essential. He was, in many ways, the master architect of modern London's infrastructure. Despite his immense achievements, Bazalgette remained a relatively modest and private man. He wasn't a flamboyant public figure like some of his contemporaries. He was a dedicated public servant, known for his integrity, his incredible work ethic, and his obsessive attention to detail. He was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1875, becoming Sir Joseph Bazalgette, a fitting honor for a man who had done more for the health of her subjects than perhaps any doctor of the age. Here's a small, personal detail that gives a glimpse into the man himself. Bazalgette had a large family, with 11 children. His work was not just a public duty but a private one, to provide for them. And his engineering talent ran in the family. Several of his sons also became respected engineers, continuing his legacy in the field. He was the head of an engineering dynasty. He finally retired in 1889, after 40 years of service to the City of London. He died just 2 years later, in 1891. And this is where we find a strange and slightly sad twist in his story. For a man who had so completely transformed London, his public commemoration was surprisingly muted. There is no grand statue of him in Trafalgar Square. For many years, the only significant monument to him was a small, easily missed memorial plaque on the Victoria Embankment, the great granite wall he himself had built. It's a modest tribute to a man whose real monument lies unseen and unheard, beneath the feet of millions of Londoners every day. Historians and biographers have often debated why Bazalgette is not more of a household name. Unlike other great Victorian figures like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, he remains relatively obscure to the general public. Perhaps it's because his greatest work was invisible. You can stand in awe of a bridge or a great ship, but it's hard to get excited about a sewer, no matter how brilliant it is. His legacy was one of public health, of quiet, reliable function, not of dramatic, visible spectacle. But that legacy has proven to be astonishingly durable. The main intercepting sewers that Bazalgette designed and built in the 19th century are, for the most part, still the backbone of London's sanitation system today. They have been extended, upgraded, and supplemented with modern treatment plants, but his core network of brick tunnels continues to do the job he designed it for. That just-in-case factor he built in, doubling the capacity for a future he couldn't predict, is the reason the system didn't fail as London's population grew from 2.5 million to nearly 9 million. His true legacy is not a statue, but the absence of something, the absence of cholera, the absence of typhoid, and the absence of a great city-stopping stink. He is remembered every time a Londoner turns on a tap and drinks a glass of water without fear, and every time a summer heatwave passes without turning the Thames into a public health emergency. His work is a silent, constant, and life-saving gift to the future. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, back in the present day. You're walking through London now. The city is a vibrant, chaotic, modern metropolis. The air, while not exactly pristine, doesn't threaten to kill you. The River Thames, though still a busy urban waterway, is cleaner than it has been in 200 years. You might even see a seal or a porpoise swimming near the city centre, a sight that would have been utterly inconceivable to a Victorian. It's easy to take all this for granted. It's easy to forget the crisis that made it all possible. Every time you walk along the Victoria Embankment, enjoying the view, You are walking on top of Bazalgette, this low-level sewer. Every time you flush a toilet in London, you are sending your own small contribution into a system whose fundamental design was conceived in the heat and panic of 1858. The work of the past is not past, it is a living, breathing, and flowing part of the present. This brings us to a truth that is both comforting and a little unsettling. Our cities, our civilization, are built on a foundation of things we would rather not think about. We are utterly dependent on a vast, hidden network of pipes, tunnels, and treatment plants that silently manage the consequences of our own existence. We have become masters of making our waste disappear, so much so that we forget it even exists. The story of the Great Stink is a perfect parable for this. It's a story about what happens when that system fails, when the invisible becomes shockingly visible, when the stuff we flush away refuses to stay away. It's a reminder that the line between a functioning, healthy city and a fetid, disease-ridden swamp is sometimes just a few well-laid brick tunnels. Here's one final, slightly quirky detail to leave you with. In recent years, a new type of urban explorer has emerged in London: the drainers. These are people who, much like the touchiers of the 19th century, illicitly explore the city's hidden infrastructure. They lift manhole covers and descend into the Victorian sewer system, documenting its incredible brickwork and cathedral-like junctions. Their photos and videos reveal a stunningly beautiful and well-preserved subterranean world. It's a strange testament to Bazalgette's work that his sewers, after 150 years of carrying the city's filth, are now considered a destination for adventurous photographers. But the story isn't over. As London continues to grow, Bazalgette's system, for all its foresight, is finally reaching its limits. The city is currently undertaking its next great sewer project, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, a massive new, deep-level sewer being built to capture the overflows that still pollute the river during heavy rain. It's a project that costs billions of pounds, a modern-day echo of Bazalgette's own struggle. It seems every few generations, London has to relearn the lesson of 1858. You can ignore what's under your feet for only so long before it comes back to haunt you. The ultimate historical lesson of the Great Stink is perhaps a debate about progress itself. Was it a triumphant story of human ingenuity conquering a problem, or was it a cautionary tale about how societies often need to be pushed to the absolute brink of disaster before they are willing to make the necessary investments in their own future? It's both. It took the worst smell imaginable to create one of the greatest leaps forward in public health. It required a crisis to create a consensus. So, the next time you find yourself in a city, any city, take a moment. Think about the invisible world beneath your feet. Think about the engineers, the planners, and the nameless navvies who built it. Think about the delicate, hidden machinery that keeps the modern world clean and safe. We are all, in our own way, grateful and forgetful children of the Great Stink, living in a world made possible by a summer when a river of poop almost destroyed London. And with that, our journey through the grimy, fragrant, and strangely inspiring streets of Victorian London comes to a close. The echoes of the navvies' pickaxes have faded. The roar of the pumping stations has softened into a distant hum. The sense of panic has given way to the quiet, steady flow of a system that works, a system that lets a city sleep peacefully. As you get ready to drift off now, perhaps you can imagine that sense of profound relief. The feeling of opening a window and breathing in air that is simply there, not a threat, not a poison, just the cool night breeze. Feel the city around you breathing. It's great. Hidden lungs and arteries doing their silent, vital work. Every hum of a distant appliance, every sigh of the wind outside your window, becomes part of that vast, living machine that keeps us safe. You can let go of the story now. Let the images of the past dissolve like sugar in water. The frantic politicians, the heroic engineers, the monstrous cartoons. They can all recede, leaving behind only a sense of calm, a feeling of gratitude for the quiet, unseen things that support us. You are safe, you are comfortable, and the air you breathe is clean. Let that simple thought be the anchor that gently pulls you down into a deep and restful sleep. Let your own breathing become as slow, unsteady, and reliable as the great, hidden rivers flowing far beneath the sleeping city. The end of the article. Good night.